A king is buried under a parking lot in Leicester, England, and nobody knows it. A team of scientists is about to run a DNA test that will confirm his identity with more certainty than almost any historical figure in existence. And that same test is about to reveal something else entirely. A break somewhere in the royal bloodline that nobody was looking for. Somewhere between one of England's most famous kings and the modern day, a child was born who was not who everyone believed him to be. The throne kept moving. The crown kept passing. But somewhere along the way, biology and history stopped agreeing with each other. This is not a rumor pulled from a tabloid. It comes from one of the most carefully verified ancient DNA studies ever conducted on a named historical individual, carried out by geneticists at the University of Leicester, and published in the peer-reviewed journal Nature Communications. Dr. Turi King, who led genetic analysis, and Professor Kevin Schurer, a genealogist who mapped the family tree across more than 5 centuries, worked together with archaeologists, osteologists, and historians to identify remains that had lain forgotten since 1485. The excavation itself was organized by the University of Leicester in partnership with Leicester City Council and the Richard III Society, with the search originally championed by historian Philippa Langley, and the genetic follow-up work was later supported by a research grant from the Wellcome Trust, one of the largest biomedical research funders in the world. Their findings were reviewed, replicated, and confirmed by the wider scientific community, and the case remains one of the most cited examples of forensic genetics applied to a documented historical figure. This is not speculation dressed up as science. This is science that happened to stumble onto one of the most quietly explosive discoveries in royal history. To understand what they found, it helps to think of the Y-chromosome the way you'd think of a surname passed from father to son. A surname does not change because of anything the son does. It changes only if the man raising him is not biologically his father. The Y-chromosome works almost exactly the same way. It travels from father to son, generation after generation, virtually unchanged, like a name stamped onto a family line and copied forward without alteration. If every father-to-son link along a chain is biologically accurate, the Y chromosome at the end of that chain should still closely resemble the Y chromosome at the start of it, even if 500 years and 19 generations separate them. Now stack a second comparison onto that same idea. 500 years is longer than the entire existence of the United States as a country, and 19 generations is roughly the same number of links as if you traced your own family, unbroken, back to the time before Columbus ever crossed the Atlantic. That is the length of chain scientists were about to test. In 2012, archaeologists began digging beneath a council car park in Leicester, on the site once occupied by the choir of Greyfriars Church. Historical records suggested this was where King Richard III, the last Plantagenet monarch of England, had been hastily buried after his death at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. What they found, almost immediately, humiliated following the battle. The bones were the right age, buried in the right location, showing signs of a high-status diet. Radiocarbon dating placed the remains within the correct window of the late 15th century, and isotope analysis of the bones and teeth suggested a childhood spent partly outside England, consistent with historical accounts that Richard spent part of his youth abroad. Everything pointed toward Richard III. But pointing was not proof. Proof would have to come from DNA, and DNA required something to compare it against. Living relatives, separated from the skeleton by 5 centuries of births, deaths, marriages, and migrations. Here's the part that turns this from an archaeology story into a genetic story. Extracting usable genetic material from a 500-year-old skeleton is not simple. Ancient DNA degrades over time, fragmenting into short, damaged strands that are easily contaminated by anyone who has ever touched the bones since burial. Researchers pulled their samples from a tooth and from a section of femur, working in controlled laboratory conditions, specifically designed to prevent modern DNA from contaminating a sample that old. To confirm identity, they then needed living relatives to compare that fragile genetic material against. They traced 2 separate lines of descent. The first ran through the maternal side, mitochondrial DNA, which passes from mother to child largely unchanged, allowing scientists to trace an unbroken thread all the way from Richard III's sister, Anne of York, down through 17 generations to 2 living descendants in the present day, including a Canadian-born furniture maker named Michael Ibsen. When researchers compared the mitochondrial DNA from the skeleton to these living descendants, they got a striking result. It matched almost perfectly with one relative and differed by only a single genetic letter in the other, a tiny variation entirely consistent with the natural mutation rate expected over 17 generations. Combined with the radiocarbon dating, the battle wounds, the scoliosis, and the burial location, the team concluded with a probability exceeding 99.9999% that the bones belonged to Richard III. The identification was, for all practical purposes, certain. and that's exactly where most stories about Richard III's DNA would end, except this one didn't. Because while the maternal line was confirming everything perfectly, the team ran a second independent test, this time on the Y chromosome, the paternal line. If the skeleton really was Richard III, his Y chromosome should closely match that of living male line descendants of Edward III, Richard's great-great-grandfather, since Y chromosomes are supposed to travel father to son unaltered, like that surname passed down the generations. Researchers located 5 living men who, according to centuries of documented genealogy compiled by Professor Schurrer, all descended in an unbroken male line from Edward III through the Somerset family, right down to Henry Somerset, the 5th Duke of Beaufort. On paper, this should have been simple confirmation. 4 of the 5 living men shared a consistent Y chromosome type with each other. But when researchers compared that Y chromosome to the one extracted from the skeleton in the Leicester car park, the skeleton they had just confirmed beyond reasonable, doubt was Richard III. It did not match. Not close, not similar, a completely different genetic signature. Let's pause on what that actually means, because it is easy to skim past. This wasn't a case of the wrong skeleton. The mitochondrial DNA, the radiocarbon dating, the battle wounds, and the spinal curvature had already locked in Richard III's identity with near total certainty. What the Y chromosome mismatch revealed instead was something happening inside the documented family tree itself, somewhere between Edward III, who reigned in the 1300s, and the modern-day Somerset descendants. At least one child in that unbroken paper trail of fathers and sons was not, biologically, the son of the man history recorded as his father. Historians call this a false paternity event. Geneticists sometimes call it a non-paternity event. Whatever the label, the meaning is the same. Somewhere in that documented line of English nobility, someone had an affair, or a child was born under circumstances the official record never captured, and nobody at the time ever knew. The paperwork said one thing, the biology says another, and DNA, 500 years later, is the only witness that remembers the truth. In the next part of this, we go straight into how big the implications actually are, because the location of that break matters enormously. Professor Schurrer was blunt about which link in the chain carries the most weight. The critical connection sits between Edward III and his son John of Gaunt, born in 1340. If the break happened there, if John of Gaunt was not biologically the son of Edward III, then an entire branch of English royal history shifts underneath itself. John of Gaunt's descendants include the House of Lancaster, several kings of England, and through complicated genealogical routes, ties running into the modern House of Windsor itself. If instead the break occurred at John of Gaunt's own son, Henry IV, born in 1366, then Henry's later usurpation of the throne from Richard II in 1399, and everything that followed from it, the entire Lancastrian dynasty, sits on a foundation the participants themselves never knew was compromised. Nobody in the 15th century could have known. There was no test. There was no way to know. The only witness was DNA sitting quietly inside human cells, waiting 600 years to be asked the right question. Quick recap before we go further, because a lot has just landed at once. Scientists confirmed through maternal DNA that the skeleton under a Leicester car park is genuinely Richard III. At the same time, through paternal DNA, they discovered that the officially recorded royal bloodline connecting Richard III back to Edward III does not hold up genetically, meaning somewhere in that 15th century royal family, someone was not who the historical record says they were. And that raises an obvious next question. Was this a one-time fluke, or does the pattern show up again if you keep pulling the thread? There's also a question worth sitting with here, and it's one historians had already been arguing about long before anyone ran a single DNA test. The Somerset line researchers used for comparison descends from John Beaufort, one of several children born to John of Gaunt, and his mistress, Catherine Swynford, before the two eventually married. Those Beaufort children were later legitimized by royal decree and an act of parliament under Richard II, but a subsequent provision under Henry IV explicitly barred the Beaufort line from ever claiming the throne itself. And yet, decades later, it was precisely through that same Beaufort bloodline, through Lady Margaret Beaufort, mother of Henry Tudor, that the Tudor dynasty built its own claim to the English crown after defeating Richard III at Bosworth. In other words, English royal succession had already been quietly bending its own rules around this exact family line once before, on paper, for entirely political reasons, a century before genetics ever entered the conversation. The DNA discovery doesn't just reveal a hidden biological gap. It lands on top of a family line that history had already been treating as legally complicated, long before anyone knew it might be genetically complicated too. It shows up again. In 2015, a man named Patrice de Warren came forward. He had spent years tracing his own male line ancestry back through an entirely separate genealogical route, through Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, a nobleman from the 12th century who is a shared ancestor of both Richard III and the Somerset line researchers had already tested. If the royal Y chromosome truly ran unbroken from Geoffrey of Anjou down to Richard III, then de Warren's Y chromosome, coming down a completely different branch of the same family tree, should have matched both. Researchers ran the comparison. It didn't match either one. Not Richard III's. Not the Somerset lines. A second false paternity event, sitting somewhere else entirely in the same sprawling royal family tree, independently confirming what the first test had already suggested, that the unbroken male bloodline running through English royal history is, biologically, anything but unbroken. Genealogists have since pointed to yet another possible branch worth testing, the male line descendants of Richard, Earl of Cornwall, a younger brother of King Henry III, who lived in the 13th century and left surviving illegitimate sons whose own patrilineal descendants existed into the 20th century. That line, if it could be tested, might help narrow down whether the break happened earlier in the chain than anyone previously assumed, further back than Edward III himself. Two confirmed breaks, discovered through two separate genetic comparisons, triangulating on the same uncomfortable conclusion, with a third possible testing route still sitting on the table. Somewhere in that lineage, more than once, a father was not a father. Here's where it gets genuinely strange to sit with. Historians have studied false paternity rates across populations for decades, and Dr. King's own research puts the historical average at somewhere between 1% and 2% per generation, meaning across 19 generations, the statistical odds actually favored finding at least one break somewhere in the chain. In that narrow sense, this wasn't shocking to geneticists. What made it land so hard wasn't the math. It was who the math was suddenly pointing at. This wasn't an anonymous farming family in a parish record. This was the House of Plantagenet, the House of Lancaster. Possibly threads running toward the House of York, and through them, toward lines that still echo into the modern British royal family today. One thing worth sitting with here, this is not a story about Richard III being fake. His identity is one of the most rigorously confirmed in all of forensic archaeology. This is a story about what happens when a 500-year-old assumption meets a piece of evidence nobody expected to still exist. Every royal genealogy chart drawn for centuries assumed that son of meant biological son every single time, without exception. DNA doesn't care what the chart assumed. DNA only records what actually happened inside a cell, and it turns out that at least twice, possibly more, what actually happened did not match what got written down. Now here's the part that connects everything back to why this matters beyond just royal trivia. To be absolutely clear about what this evidence can and cannot prove, this is critical, and researchers themselves were careful about it. The Y chromosome comparison tells us that a mismatch exists somewhere across a chain of 19 generations. It does not, and cannot, pinpoint exactly which generation the break occurred, in without additional ancient DNA samples from intermediate individuals along that chain. Samples that, in most cases, simply don't exist because most of those individuals were never exhumed or tested. Nobody is claiming John of Gaunt specifically was illegitimate. Nobody is claiming Henry IV specifically was not Edward III's genetic descendant. What the evidence shows is a range of possibility across roughly 6 centuries, narrowed only by which specific individuals along that documented line have themselves been genetically tested. It's also worth being precise about a second distinction here. This is individual-level evidence about one specific, well-documented lineage, not a broad population-level ancestry estimate. Unlike some ancient DNA studies that describe general migration patterns across thousands of anonymous individuals, this result is unusually specific. Named people, named generations, a documented paper trail stretching across 5.5 centuries. And to be equally clear on the legal and constitutional side, none of this retroactively invalidates any actual historical reign. Royal succession in medieval and early modern England was determined by law, by recognized birthright, and by political reality, not by 21st century genetic testing. Every monarch who sat on that throne sat on it legitimately under the law of their time, regardless of what a Y chromosome sequenced 600 years later might suggest about their biological ancestry. Biology and legitimacy, it turns out, are not always asking the same question. It's also worth being honest about where this trail runs out. This particular break sits inside the Plantagenet and early Lancastrian male line, tested specifically through descendants, connecting Edward III to the Somerset family, and separately through the line running from Geoffrey of Anjou. The current British royal family's own male line ancestry runs through an entirely different, much more recent route, tracing back to the House of Hanover and then the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, later renamed Windsor during the First World War. Nobody has tested that specific modern male line against these medieval samples, And nothing in this research makes a direct genetic claim about the present monarchy. What the evidence does show, plainly and without exaggeration, is that the version of English royal ancestry written into official records for over 500 years contains at least 2 documented points where biology and paperwork parted ways, and there is no way to know, without further testing of intermediate remains that may never be found, exactly how many more such points are quietly sitting unnoticed somewhere else in the tree, which leaves us with something almost poetic. For centuries, the story of the English monarchy was written in ink, sealed in wax, and guarded in genealogical scrolls, treated as unquestionable fact. This king begat this king, who begat this king, all the way down an unbroken chain stretching back to conquerors and crusaders. Kingdoms were fought for, wars were justified. Entire dynasties rose and collapsed on the strength of that one assumption, that the name written beside father in the record was always the biological truth. Nobody thought to ask whether the chain might have quietly broken somewhere along the way, because there was no way to ask. There was no tool capable of listening to what a body actually remembered. Every chronicler, every herald, every royal genealogist who ever drew that family tree by hand was working entirely on trust, generation after generation, with no way to check their own work. Then, 600 years later, a team of archaeologists dug into a parking lot looking for a lost king, and in the process of proving exactly who he was, they accidentally exposed a secret that no historian, no chronicler, and no member of the royal family itself ever knew existed. The bones told the truth the paperwork never could. Richard III himself never knew. Henry Tudor, who killed him and took his crown, never knew. Every genealogist who spent a career mapping this exact family tree, believing every line on it was solid, never knew either. It took a parking lot, a forgotten skeleton, and a laboratory technique that wouldn't exist for another 5 centuries to finally ask the one question. Nobody in 600 years had the tools to ask. And somewhere in that gap between what was written down and what actually happened, an entire dynasty's family tree quietly rewrote itself, without a single person in it ever finding out. So here's the question worth sitting with. Every family tree, royal or otherwise, is built on an assumption nobody usually questions, that the name on the record matches the biology underneath it. Richard III's own identity was confirmed beyond doubt, but the chain connecting him to the throne he sat on carries at least one link, maybe more, that biology quietly disagrees with. Tell me in the comments which part of this actually surprised you more, the fact that a king's exact grave could be identified with 99% certainty after 500 years, or the fact is that the same test revealed his own royal bloodline wasn't entirely what everyone assumed it to be.